Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh at welcome po muli sa ating episode ng MHS Deliver sa segmentong MHS Discusses. Ako po ang inyong lingkod Bangsamoro, Homecaster Joy Bintemran Muhammad. At ngayon kasama ko po ang isa sa mga speakers noong unang IOM DSUD Local Shelter Rollout. At isa po ang coordinator ng Philippine Shelter Cluster. Kasama ko po ngayon si Sir Lionel Dosdos. Sir Leo, welcome po sa aming episodes.
Walaikum salam. I hope I pronounced it correctly.
Walaikum salam.
Thank you very much for having this opportunity, for giving me this opportunity to talk about Philippine Shelter Cluster. And hi, and thank you again to our listeners also for this show.
Welcome po sa ating episode ng MHS Discusses. Ngayong araw talakayin po natin ang organization ni Sir Leo, ang Philippine Shelter Cluster. No, sir, hindi ko na po patatagalin. Would you like to give us a small background? What are the mandates? What is the mission of Philippine Shelter Cluster?
Okay, so Philippine Shelter Cluster is that we are actually a part, or we are the country level of the Global Shelter Cluster. So the Shelter Cluster, in short, it's an IASC, so it's an interagency standing committee. It's a coordination mechanism under the Humanitarian Affairs led by the UN Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or UN OCHA. So we share this coordination role together with the UNHCR, or the High Commission for the Refugees. So the High Commission for the Refugees, or UNHCR, deals with the shelter coordination at times of conflicts, while IFRC, or International Federation of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Society, deals with shelter coordination during the times of natural disasters. So we're talking here of earthquake, landslides, typhoons or super typhoons, and storm surges or natural calamities, or tsunami also. Here in the Philippines, the coordination, the shelter cluster, rather started in 2005, at the same time when the humanitarian cluster coordination mechanism was instituted, was in place. And in the Philippines, the first response, the first coordination action that's done by the shelter cluster was done in 2006 for Typhoon Durian, or this is Typhoon Riming in Albay. At the time, it was more of like families, households that got affected with the landslides because of the typhoon. At the same time, also, Mount Mayon was having little tremors and eruptions. So that was the challenge at the time. So from that moment on until late last year, we've been coordinating for shelter response in times of natural disasters. I'm talking here of Typhoon Pablo in 2012, Sendong in 2011, and then you have Ball earthquake, Typhoon Yolanda, and then lately it was Typhoon Odette also. So
for clarification, the MHSD, the Ministry of Human Settlements and Development, does not actually tackle temporary shelters. Our mandates are more on for permanent shelters. So yes, our beneficiaries would most likely fall under the poorest of the poor, or IDPs, or former combatants of the MILF, or victims of natural disaster. However, we deliver permanent shelters which take a much longer time to consolidate, construct, and finish. However, you focus more on temporary shelters, but you're more of a PSC is more of a coordinator. Does that mean that PSC does not directly give the shelters to the victims, to the beneficiaries?
yes, correct on that aspect, that for Philippine Shelter, we don't do direct project or program implementation for shelter, but rather we coordinate for the various shelter programs that's being carried out by our shelter partners. So we're talking here specifically, let's say for example, Philippine Red Cross, you have IOM coming from the United Nations group, you have Plan International or Catholic Relief Service. So these different organizations would have their own programs. What we do is that we coordinate, make sure that they don't overlap in the same area when they provide shelter coordination, shelter programming or shelter intervention during
so that
disaster.
no items can be wasted or
yes, correct. And then the other one is also, which is very important, is that we do have established the shelter guidelines. So let's say, for example, minimum criteria for shelter. So when we take, for example, when we give GI sheets or the yero in Tagalog, or sin, yung bubong, the roofing material, is that it has to be of certain thickness. So the minimum thickness is 0.44 mm or gauge 26. Take for example, if we provide transitional shelters, because we cannot provide the permanent shelter because that would become a development intervention. But for transitional shelter, these are humanitarian, so it's like life-saving. It's while the government would prepare for the permanent shelter, so that to give families safe, human, decent living spaces, we give transitional shelter that would last between 2 to 5 years. And if you take care of your shelter very well, it could probably last 10 years. So for that one, so the minimum criteria that the floor area for any of the shelter design for transitional shelter, it's 3.5 per square meter per family member, and the minimum amount, it's like 5 families. So that's our, for the Philippines, that's actually the average number. So you end up a floor area of your transitional shelter of around 18.5 square meters. So regardless of you have, this ornate with terrace, or just a basic like square shelter design with probably 2 windows and a door. So it has to be, the minimum criteria is that it has to be 18.5. So that's transitional. Unfortunately, for now, for humanitarian response, it's transitional shelter. And as also to give emphasis is that because we're only coordinating for disaster, for emergencies, natural disaster. So let's say in a different context, it would different group, it's UNHCR, but for us it's
the natural disasters would fall under your coordination. However, combats or a war-stricken zone, it would fall under the United Nations
High Commission for the Refugees. Yeah, so then they would have taken over. I would just like made mention that, let's say for example, I'm currently I'm being supported by IFRC, and then in the context of the Barn region, so I do know for a fact that the IFRC would had continuously and consistently been supporting Philippine Red Cross in response to the various emergencies. So regardless of it's either natural disasters or man-made, if it was conflict scenarios of people like evacuating because there was this peace and order instability in certain communities, IFRC and Red Cross has been active into that area. I just not so privy and particular of how the responses is, because it's a different zone for them. So that's operation side. I'm doing coordination.
We can focus on your coordination zone. So speaking of coordination, can you give us a simulation? How does your coordination actually work? Can you cite a recent example on how you proceeded to coordinate with agencies on a natural disaster stricken area?
So yes, I could probably give you an example of like traditionally what we have is that we have pre-disaster, pre-landfall coordination with the national government. I'm speaking particularly of coordinating with the OCD, with the Office of Civil Defense, with the NDRRMC, and then previously it was DSWD. Now we are transitioning to the SUD, coordinating with the SUD. But one thing particular with the latest disaster for Odette is that you have the complexity of having COVID, and that foreign travel was restricted. Yes. So then, because of that one, we had, and I wasn't there yet. Okay. I wasn't here yet to this post. Although, so what happened for the Philippine Shelter Cluster is that we had a remote support. So the remote support came all the way from Geneva, and also we have colleagues that was working from Australia. This is a part of like the commitments of the Australian Red Cross made with the global shelter cluster. So they had staff there. You have technical specialists for shelter doing the remote support for the Philippines in the meantime. And then finally they were able to send, when travel restrictions was lifted, then we had the surge delegate all the way coming from Spain. Elena, she came over to the Philippines and did the coordination at the national level, and then she went down to went around that affected communities, regions. I'm talking of Bohol, Cebu, Negros, and then of course Caraga and Southern Leyte. Went around, and then because the government was having they were saying all Caraga and Southern Leyte was badly hit, and that's where a lot of the attention is much needed. That's where they went, and on that side, given consideration to the geographical separation, also complexity, what the shelter cluster did was that assigned shelter cluster members, shelter cluster focals, to be the focals in each of that region. So for Caraga region, you have IOM serving as focal, and then you have Catholic Relief Service, or CRS, serving as focal for Southern Leyte. And until up to this moment, IOM is still doing the hub coordination, while CRS and they have transitioned out already because the humanitarian operations for Southern Leyte has been on scaling down, and a lot of the partners, a lot of the humanitarian actors has left. And if you look at the national level, is that my role is that I've been providing technical assistance to the two hubs. So this is in terms of providing guidance on let's say, for example, the use and upcycling of coconut trees.
Oh.
So to become like the fallen coconut trees, they are timbered off, like they're been sawn off the particular cuts, so that you could utilize them into timber for shelter reconstruction. That idea, the technical working group, started in 2012 for Typhoon Bofa. So this is a best practice that we kind of
That's
carry
more than
on.
10 years ago.
Yes. So if you realize, this is how also we do as a cluster and also as a system, we provide, we take notes of our best practices and duplicate it in the next response. There are also instances where the practice is already good, but then there are still areas of improvement, and we continuously improve them. So these are the things that we do, both at the local and also at the national level. We also do coordination as cross clusters. So we would say for example, in some of the areas we have cluster members saying, we could only provide core house. This means that it's just a house without latrine. So what we do is that we would go as the shelter cluster. I would then be referring the concern to the wash cluster and be asking, do you have any members that is providing latrines? Maybe we could complement each other. Then that would work perfectly. And we don't only do this for one cluster. So we work with different clusters. Say, for example, protection, CCCM, or camp coordination and camp management. So we do things. We look at things. We also we also join. We collaborate. Work collaboratively also with the cash working group. This is in the context of, say, cash rates for the cash working, cash for work. So you know that you're supposed to pay for the laborers for those who are constructing houses. So then we have to collaborate to make sure that the rates that we are giving is not so high.
Standard.
It's a standard that's uniform across all regions, across all partners. So usually that's the cash working group that would be responsible in putting up that standards, and we have to look and consult them.
You basically bridge between all the important pillars that one would need to make a sustainable shelter. Your shelters the shelters you coordinate with are standardized for 3 to 5 years, minimum, maximum, depends. And is this in preparation for the permanent shelters in construction? Ideally, after 3 to 5 years, there would be a permanent shelter that they can transfer to.
Yes, that's the back idea of it. So the only reason why we're here, why we're doing humanitarian response, is that in context specifically talking about the Philippines, is that we know that there's a functioning system. The government has our national government, even our local government has a capacity to respond. Only is that at the scale of the disaster, it's like it's a bit overwhelmed and they need a little bit of space and time to process their things, to pick up these things. So
Unfortunately, bureaucratic pa rin ang gobyerno for most things. Is that a thing that hinders most of the speedy reactions?
but for us, we are here to, that's why we are here. That's actually our purpose to be here. So to complement the response efforts of the government. So us providing transitional shelters is giving recognition also that there is like systems in place within the government, regardless if it takes time or not, but this is a working system. So then to complement that one, to augment onto that one, that's why we're constructing rather transitional shelters to buy time for the government to identify land, identify like areas for resettlement, and to buy time for government to procure resources to construct those permanent shelters.
The MHSD can relate. Acquiring land is one of the most difficult parts, but the most necessary steps in a permanent shelter, in a permanent housing project. It's very difficult to ensure all the legalities for it. So it does take a very long time to, and not to mention the construction and all the drama that comes during that.
Yes, which is I totally agree with that one. It's in fact also the reason why we are doing all of this disaster preparedness, all of this like technical assistance that we are giving now to the SUD, assisting together, working hand in hand with IOM and the donors of IOM. We are working with the SUD and making it's actually like cascading it to the provincial government, for the municipal government, realizing that say land banking is a way also for disaster preparedness, and that identifying for those communities that could be at risk whenever there's a disaster that would happen, particularly like natural calamities. Then it's one way of like mitigating the displacement of those families is to provide like a good land banking practice and plan for that one, and making it see that there is this importance. That's the reason of why we are here. That's the reason of this of the exercise.
You must be exercising quite a lot. Your travel schedule is very full at the moment.
Yes, because it's like there's no, we have a little bit of time and reprieve from the the natural disaster, like the reprieve from the typhoons that would usually like hit the Philippines. So we're taking yes. So we know that come around September, October, then you have monsoon, you have habagat hitting again, battering again Philippines. So while we have this sort of like lull period, then this is a perfect time like to pick up, to do disaster preparedness programming, and this is what we are. This is what some of the things for the Philippine Shelter Cluster is currently like doing and engaging. It's also in a way engaging all of the various shelter actors that's out in the field in different parts of the country, of telling them this is how we could complement communities, this is how we could complement the government in building strong and disaster resilient communities.
Inshallah, we will be building those until they are resilient enough to stand on their own.
Yeah.
That's a good mission. And aside for that, so your technical assistance, you're currently going through that right now. Would you like to share your schedule to our audience? What are the activities you're currently doing right now, aside for the IOM shelter rollout?
Yeah, so outside of like the IOM shelter rollout, so we're in the process of like developing the strategic advisory group for the Philippine Shelter Cluster. So the strategic advisory group is the panel of shelter actors where we are trying to develop the shelter strategy of how we move forward as Philippine Shelter Cluster and how we could complement the government. So how we could complement this program designs and the aspirations of the SUD. And that's one. We are also in the process of like developing the country-specific environmental profile. So this is a compendum, a collection of best practices in terms of like environmental conservation, greening in the context of shelter programming. So it's like this best practices I've mentioned already of like
The coconut
upcycling of the coconut trees. Those are just some of the ideas that we have.
standardized roofing materials,
Yeah,
standardized housing
and then-
sizes.
Yes, also like probably move into cutting off like greenhouse emissions when we're doing shelter response. So these are some of the things that we will, as shelter cluster coordinator, I'll be leading that discussion together with all other shelter partners.
Would it be full of non-government organizations?
No, this is a mix. So the current shelter cluster profile of members is that it's a mix. You have coming from the United Nations, you have the international organization, NGOs, non-governmental organization, and then we have the local NGOs. We have the national NGOs. So I'm talking here of, say, for example, Plan for International, Habitat for Humanity. You have PDRN. You have Rotary Club of Cebu actively joining us. You have Ramon Abuetes Foundation also being active in the field. So these are just some of the members that I could mention to you. That's like that has been actively in Cebu.
Just on the top of your head, that's not even the whole list.
Yes, but that's not the whole list. And then we have also donors that's like actively joining us, checking around and seeing how they could complement, also how they could fund the projects that a lot of the shelter actors are doing. You have also the academe helping us draft this policies, providing us technical guidance, providing us the scientific
The research
techniques, the research needed for us to effectively improve the delivery of the shelter solutions and shelter programs.
Is that are you expecting to come out with a manual, book?
These are so for one is that it's a strategic direction. It's a paper that would just basically align and identify what are the priorities as shelter cluster members, and then as a coordination body of how we are going to do things. And so essentially it would also align and would make easier for donors to identify which of the programs they wanted to fund. So that's one of the thing. And then for the environmental profile, it's also a guidance note. It's a resource document that hopefully both the government and the non-government organization could refer to whenever we talk about shelter design, shelter program.
Made available, hopefully PDF.
Yes, it's available. So it would become available into the website. So the shelter cluster has a website. It's called sheltercluster.org. So it's one word. It's sheltercluster.org.
The editor will put it over here.
Yes, I would really appreciate it, and do come and visit that site, because even for for ordinary people, you have instructions of how do you fortify your house. How do you make it DRR compliant? Let's say, for example,
Disaster risk compliant?
Yes, disaster risk reduction compliant.
Okay.
So incorporating disaster DRR into your shelter design, into your houses. So making sure that your roof wouldn't easily fly off during strong winds and typhoon, or making it like your house safe for earthquake. So earthquake proofing. So we have the 8 key messages. So it teaches you how to put proper bracing on your window frames, on your doors.
Is it
proper
like
bracing.
do-it-yourself instructions?
It has a technical drawing, but it's also a type of like do-it-yourself. So it's so easy to understand, easy to follow some of the things. You can even like make use of the existing materials that you have. So it's like, if you don't have, like if you just have rebars, then you could like bend rebars to a particular direction, then that would like strengthen and fortify the post of your house, so that if like there's an earthquake, it's strong enough to withstand it. So you have this knowledge. And then also for our shelter experts, you have technical drawings of the different houses. You can even in fact, let's say, look at shelter designs from other countries. So we store it there, and you could like appreciate, download, print, and use it. So this is the wealth of information that you can find at
A great
Shelter
example
Cluster.
of give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man a fish, he'll eat for a lifetime.
Yes, precisely. And it's also a great resource because at other instances, it's also it's easier to contact. You have email addresses for people at the global level of who you want to ask questions also, so you could find it also at the
Open
the shelter.
communication with.
Yes,
Oh,
yes. So, yeah.
wow. If you ever want to get in touch with professionals, they have their profiles on that website, which you can communicate with.
Yes.
Oh, that's amazing. Baka yun ang sunod na guest namin. Inshallah. Now that we've tackled PSC, we've tackled basic. This might be oversimplifying it, but basically you are a coordinator that bridges the gap between between different sectors to create a standardized, efficient shelter in response to natural disasters. Forgive me if that's oversimplifying it, but that's Philippine Shelter Cluster. You are you work on a national level, and you have an abundance of projects across the Philippines. Can you share a bit about what is the status of the projects you delved into? How are they going?
So, because these are humanitarian, a lot of our projects right now at core, these are humanitarian response projects. So we have to follow, a lot of them we have to follow like the donor prescriptions of those within those timelines. So for Southern Leyte, is that a lot of them has been like tailing off, has been done already. Unfortunately for Southern Leyte also, we still need a lot of funding requirement for to transition for early recovery. So for a lot of the shelter cluster members, is that what they have done already for Southern Leyte was just distribute tarpaulins, the shelter grade tarpaulins, and also repair kits. But if you look at on the ground, there's still a lot of families needing houses. So that there are still a lot of gaps and needs that needs to be addressed. On the other hand, for Carag region, there is still a lot of humanitarian actors that's also doing their programming. And this is already like they're slowly crossing over to early recovery. So this is talking about construction of transitional shelters. Yes. So that is how it looks like for the Odette affected areas. Outside of that one, it could be also that there are some couple of developmental projects. Unfortunately, I've not been monitoring for those projects, but these are also the same agencies that have been like doing shelter response. So at a number of times they would also do developmental shelter projects.
It's good to know that we are still continuing on to that. That it's, although we're getting there, we're getting to a better place. That's a good hopeful stance to be on. Aside for that, for the barn perspective, we're looking forward to the manual that you mentioned earlier. That would be very insightful in future responses, inshallah. Like you said, although we do not wish for it, we are expecting anomalies in the future. Is it still an anomaly if we're expecting it?
It's good, I would say, it's good to be prepared for any eventualities.
True.
So
prevention is better than cure.
Yes, definitely. So the interventions, the assistance that we're providing for the SUD is what we're hoping is that, and that's the reason why also we're cascading it across the Philippines, across all regions, is that it would trickle down not only of Barn region but also across the Philippines, and the idea is actually like building strong disaster resilient communities.
Inshallah, we keep that momentum going. Same with our MHSD, we continue to assist LGUs on their CLUP formulation, their comprehensive land use plan, and its integration on disaster risk reduction, the CIDRA, the climate disaster risk reduction, into their CLUPs. Before we let you go, sir, in this episode of MHS Discusses, would you like to share where the people can find you? We can have the links provided on screen. Sir, if you would like to share, I guess, a parting message to our audience.
So you could get in touch with me. My email address is COORD, COORD 1, as in the numeric number 1, .phil @sheltercluster.org, and then my contact number, I'll give it to her so that she will flash it. So
it's over here.
The director is supposed to do the, how when you're watching Korean novelas, you have the numbers popping out in the screen. So yes, and we would very much welcome messages and even queries of how we could probably reach out and help those these communities. So probably my parting message is that for Shelter Cluster, we are the Shelter Cluster, and we are coordinating for the shelter humanitarian response, and that we are always here, and we would always be here in support to those communities that's needing humanitarian assistance. But we're at the same time also we're looking forward for the day that we cease to exist, because the day we cease to exist, it's also the day that we could say that we have been successful in our mission of building strong, disaster resilient communities, and that our government, the Philippine government, has championed the disaster response, has championed anticipating the needs of that communities, and that it's disaster resilient Philippines.
Inshallah. Thank you po sir ulit sa pag-accept ng ating ambush interview.
Sukran, the pleasure was mine, and thank you very much for this opportunity of being able to talk about Shelter Cluster.
Shukran po ulit. Muli, ang kasama po natin ngayong episode ng MHS Deliver sa ating talakayan segment MHS Discusses, Sir Lionel Dosdos, Sir Leo from the Philippine Shelter Cluster. Ako po ang inyong lingkod Bangsamoro, ang inyong homecaster Joy Ria Bintemran Muhammad, nag-uulat.